They noticed him too late. A quiet old man, sitting alone outside Arlington's gates, holding a wooden box like it contained a secret the government forgot to classify. No uniform, no medals, just a face worn by decades of silence. Guards tried to turn him away, until one general stopped everything, stepped down from the funeral podium, and saluted him, not out of respect, out of debt. What was in that box? And why did the most powerful man in the cemetery call him sir? You're about to find out. It was one of those cold, sunlit mornings at Arlington where the air carries a quiet that feels earned, not by peace, but by sacrifice. The kind of day where shadows fall long over stone markers, and the wind seems to know it's moving through sacred ground. Security stood tight at the main gate. Sunglasses, earpieces, and clipboard checks. The funeral of General Irwin Thompson wasn't just another military burial. It was a high-security state event, the kind with 3-star generals in formation and the Secretary of Defense sitting in the front row. Every name on the list had been checked, verified, and cleared, and then came the man with no name. No one saw where he came from. He wasn't dropped off by a black sedan or escorted by an aide. He walked up from the grass trail behind the cemetery wall, boots caked in dried mud, jacket thin against the breeze. No hat, no medals. Just a plain brown coat that hung loose on a broad, behunched frame. In his hand, he carried a small, rectangular wooden box, smooth at the corners from wear. Not polished, not fancy, just old, handmade, and held the way a man holds something he's carried for far too long. He said nothing as he approached the gate, didn't announce himself, just stood there, about 10 paces from the entry, eyes on the flag already at half-mast. One of the guards finally noticed and stepped forward. "Sir, this is a closed ceremony. May I see your credentials?" The man didn't flinch. He just looked the guard in the eyes and said softly, "I'm not here for ceremony. I'm here for the man." There was no name offered, no rank, just that one line. But it was enough to make the guard hesitate, long enough for the first seed of suspicion, or maybe curiosity, to take root. The guard's voice didn't change. He was trained for this, to handle oddballs, reporters pretending to be relatives, even conspiracy theorists. He kept his voice level. "Sir, without clearance, I can't allow you through. This is a private funeral, military authorization only." The man didn't argue. He nodded once, like he already knew the answer, then stepped back to the edge of the path and lowered himself onto the low stone wall that lined the gates. No protest, no fuss. He simply sat, placed a box beside him, and folded his hands over his knees, his back stiff despite his age. What kind of man travels all this way, only to be turned away and say nothing? Most would plead, others would shout. But this one just waited, and that waiting did something. It gnawed at the guards, especially the younger one, who kept glancing back, unsure. The man never broke posture. He just stared straight ahead like he was still on watch, like Arlington was just another post he'd been assigned. But the real curiosity wasn't just a man. It was the box. One of the guards, a corporal not long out of basic, dared to ask, "What's in the box, sir?" The old man didn't look at him. "History," he replied. That was it. No elaboration, no explanation. And that word, history, hung in the air like a challenge. The guard didn't press him. He just walked back to his post, glancing once more over his shoulder. That moment became the first crack in a chain of protocol too rigid to flex. The higher-ups hadn't noticed the man yet. The ceremony was minutes from starting. Dignitaries had begun arriving in black cars. A marching band warmed up in the distance. But right there, just outside the chain-link barrier, a living question mark sat with history in a box. And the only man who knew the answer wasn't saying a word. The box wasn't locked. It wasn't chained. There were no seals, no brass plates, no emblems. But it drew eyes the way something sacred does. Not because it shines, but because it doesn't. A second guard, older, more seasoned, stepped away from the checkpoint and approached the man again. "We just need to be sure. Sir, can we take a look?" The man didn't answer right away. He just looked down at the box like it was a child who had finally grown up and was ready to speak for itself. Then, with deliberate care, he undid the tiny clasp and opened the lid. Inside were three things. First, a pair of rusted, blood-stained dog tags, one snapped clean in half, the chain long broken. Second, a faded photograph, black and white, edges curled, of three young soldiers covered in mud, standing shoulder to shoulder, rifles slung, grins half-formed like they didn't know if they were alive or ghosts already. And third, a letter, yellowed with time, folded into tight thirds, edges worn soft from being opened and closed too many times. The top of the letter was barely legible. To the one who never came back. That was all the guard saw before the man gently closed the box again. The guard didn't ask for more. He just stood there a long moment, swallowing whatever he'd meant to say. When he returned to the post, he said nothing, just handed the clipboard to CO and nodded toward the man. Might want to get someone from the funeral staff. That's how the story began to slip out. Not loudly, not with drama, but like an old war tune you hear faintly before you remember all the words. Within 5 minutes, a junior aide from the funeral logistics team was reading the letter. Within 10, a whisper ran up the chain like a bullet with no sound. The dog tags didn't match the guest list. The name on the letter wasn't on any file. But someone in the Pentagon had once seen that photo. And suddenly, the man with no name wasn't just a trespasser. He was a ghost walking. That morning, inside the funeral canopy, General Wallace stood reviewing his notes for the eulogy. 32 years in uniform. 2 wars. Enough medals to make his dress blues heavy. But his hand shook slightly as he gripped the podium, because he wasn't just burying a soldier. He was burying his mentor, the man who'd saved him in Laos and carried him through more battles than he could count. That's when his aide leaned in and whispered something that drained the color from his face. "Sir, we think he's here." Wallace blinked. "Who?" The aide swallowed. "Captain Boone, sir. The one from Firebase Ripcord. The one who never came back." For a moment, the world around the general paused. The band faded. The words on the page blurred. And all he could see was a jungle soaked in monsoon rain, and the man who stayed behind so the rest of them could live. Boone had been a legend in whispers, an unofficial saint of mission no one was supposed to survive. And here he was, outside the gate, holding the box that carried memories no government record ever acknowledged. General Wallace didn't wait for protocol. He didn't ask permission. He stepped down from the podium, handed his speech to the nearest officer, and walked directly toward the gate, medals clinking quietly with every step like chains of memory coming loose after decades. In the thick green hell of Vietnam, Firebase Ripcord wasn't a base. It was a target. 1969 had turned into a year of death counted by inches, and that day in July was no different. Captain Boone's unit had been ordered on a recon patrol just beyond the tree line. Nothing major, they were told, just a sweep, standard protocol. But standard doesn't apply when you walk into an ambush. 30 men left that morning. 13 made it back. Boone wasn't one of them, at least not officially. What really happened was whispered about years later in VFW halls and behind bar counters. Boone had led a counterassault after his lieutenant took a bullet to the chest. He carried a man 2 clicks under fire, took a grenade to the shoulder, and kept moving. When the radio cut out, Boone used a flare to draw air cover. He was last seen turning back to cover the final evac from a ridge he never should have reached alone. Then nothing. No body. No dog tags. Just red clay, jungle silence, and an official report that called it a tactical loss. But some men in his unit never believed he died. They believed something else, that he disappeared on purpose, that he'd taken the fall so the rest of them could make a home clean, because the mission had been off the books and the brass needed a ghost more than a survivor. And now, half a century later, that ghost was sitting at Arlington, holding the truth in a wooden box while a nation prepared to honor someone who had never forgotten him. Some truths stayed buried not because they're forgotten, but because too many men in high places agreed never to speak them out loud. That's what General Wallace began to realize as he reread the wrinkled letter pulled from the old man's box. The handwriting was shaky, but unmistakable. It was from General Irwin Thompson himself, dated nearly 2 decades earlier, and addressed simply, "To the one who should have had stars before I ever earned mine." It hit like a gut punch. Wallace had trained under Thompson. He'd idolized him. But he never knew about this. Never knew there was a man who had once saved the general's life and then vanished by design. A man erased for the sake of bureaucratic cleanup. Sacrifice not in war, but in the quiet aftermath of a failed op that Washington never wanted to admit happened. Wallace rushed to the tent behind the canopy where the funeral staff and security detail had set up their operations. He demanded access to the classified guest logs and the historical archive profiles for all known members of Thompson's Vietnam service record. Boone's name wasn't there. Not once. Not under his rank. Not even under his alias. But there was one anomaly. A blank personnel number from Firebase Ripcord, redacted, closed, stamped with notation. Status unknown, presumed Kia, no recovery. Whoever this man was, the government had erased him on paper, but not in memory, not in spirit, and not in the heart of the man, lying in the coffin just yards away. Boone wasn't supposed to exist, but the fact that he was sitting quietly outside the gate, carrying nothing but silence, said everything that file never could. It was a security breach anymore. It was a reckoning. And now someone had to make it right. There's a kind of authority that doesn't need a microphone or a badge. It comes from knowing the difference between doing what's right and doing what's allowed. General Wallace wasn't interested in permissions anymore. He stormed out of the staff tent, straightened his coat, adjusted the single black ribbon on his chest, the one given for service too classified to be named, and walked back through the assembled crowd like a man shedding every layer of ceremony he'd ever worn. The funeral had already begun. The honor guard had formed lines. The band was mid-processional, and the chaplain was standing by with folded hands. Dignitaries whispered as Wallace interrupted the order, marching past him like a storm that had changed direction. He passed the coffin, past the wreaths, past the Secretary of Defense, and never once looked back. When he reached the gate, he didn't let the guards open it. He opened it himself. The man on the stone wall looked up, but didn't rise. He just nodded once, slow, with the calm of a soldier who'd seen too much to flinch. Wallace came to a full stop in front of him and snapped to attention, offering a salute so sharp it cut the air. "Captain Boone," he said quietly, voice cracking under the weight of years. "It's time." Boone didn't ask what he meant. He just stood, slowly, and picked up the box. "You sure you want to do this?" he asked, voice low. Wallace nodded. "We buried you once. I'm not letting us bury you again by silence." Without another word, the general gestured forward. The ceremony had been paused. The band was silent. The crowd watched, confused, murmuring. But those who'd served, those who understood, stood a little straighter, because they could smell in the wind. Something important was about to be remembered. S. Boone crossed a boundary into Arlington. A ripple moved through the crowd. Not a cheer, not applause, but a shifting of posture, like something invisible and heavy had just entered sacred ground. At first, no one knew who he was, just a man in an old coat, no uniform, no ribbons. But those who did remember, men seated quietly in the third and fourth rows wearing outdated service caps and canes at their knees, they knew. One of them stood. Another followed. By the time Boone reached the front row, 7 men were standing stiffly, tears in their eyes, saluting with hands that shook but didn't fall. These were the survivors of Firebase Ripcord, the ones who'd made it home because Boone never did. They'd gone decades with that guilt etched into their bones, some too scared to look for him, others told to keep quiet by men who wore stars and expected obedience. One of them, Lieutenant Miles Henderson, now in his 80s, removed his cap, stepped forward, and whispered through cracked lips, "Captain Boone, my God." Boone smiled faintly and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Still standing, Lieutenant." Henderson broke then, just folded into Boone like a son finding a father he'd buried in his mind 100 times. There were no cameras clicking, no speeches given, just something raw and clean that swept across the rows of aging warriors, too long forgotten, and brought them back into the light. The reunion wasn't loud. It was quiet, sacred, an unspoken promise that time hadn't erased everything, just covered it in dust. And now, finally, someone was wiping it clean. General Wallace took the podium briefly, not for a eulogy, but for a confession. His voice didn't boom. It cracked, low and steady, as he opened a second envelope, handed to him moments earlier by Boone. It was General Irwin Thompson's final instruction, sealed years before his death. Wallace read it aloud. If the man known as Boone is still alive, then this coffin does not belong to me until he carries it. He carried me once in the jungle of ripcord when I was too weak to stand. He dragged me through fire, out of blast zone, and into a field where I could breathe again. I lived because of him. I became a leader because of him. And I'll rest easy only if he leads me one last time. Silence followed. The kind of silence that feels bigger than any anthem. Boone didn't move right away. He just stared down at the coffin like it was something heavier than death. Maybe shame, maybe forgiveness. Then he stepped forward, still holding the box, and placed it gently on the edge of the casket, right above the folded flag. He stood there for a long moment, and when he finally whispered, "Let's take you home," everyone heard it, even those who didn't know what it meant. The general's final wish wasn't protocol. It wasn't regulation. It was redemption. And Boone, the man once listed as missing and erased by bureaucracy, was now the only one who could fulfill it. The procession began with no music, just footsteps. Boone walked slowly, leading the casket flanked by General Wallace and two other survivors from ripcord, men who had once bled in the same mud, now standing straight, as if time hadn't bent their backs. The crowd remained on its feet, not out of duty but reverence. Some cried, others saluted, but most simply watched, wide-eyed, unsure if they were witnessing history or correcting it. Reporters who had once pointed cameras now lowered them. One young photojournalist, barely in her 20s, whispered, "This isn't for clicks. This is something else." And she was right, because something rare was happening. The country was watching a ghost come back to life, not for glory, but to lay one of his own to rest. In that walk, Boone didn't look heroic. He looked heavy, like every step cost him years, and every face he passed reminded him of someone he couldn't save. But he walked anyway, because some debts don't expire, and some promises get kept even if it takes a lifetime. When they reached the grave site, Boone stepped forward, placed his hand on the coffin, and whispered something only the dead could hear. Then, slowly, he turned back the crowd, holding the box once more, and looked every officer, every politician, every soldier in the eye. He didn't ask for thanks. He didn't want applause. But what he saw on their faces was enough. Recognition. A kind of nod that said, "We know now. We remember." And in that moment, for the first time in half a century, Boone wasn't a missing man. He was a soldier, finally seen. For a second, maybe two, nothing happened. The wind rustled the flags, and the sun hit the brass on the coffin just right, casting reflections across the crowd like echoes of old battles. Then, like the first drop of rain breaking a drought, a single Marine in dress blues stepped forward. His face was etched with years, his back still straight despite the cane hanging from his belt. He lifted his hand, slowly, and gave a crisp salute, not to the coffin, not to the generals, but to Boone. That was the crack that opened the floodgate. One by one, veterans in the audience, some in uniform, others in flannel shirts and ball caps that read Vietnam, Desert Storm, Iraq, rose to their feet. Salutes went up. Hats came off. Even those who didn't know Boone understood. This man had paid dues deeper than any paycheck, carried weight heavier than any medal. The silence didn't break into applause. It turned into something weightier, an atmosphere where breath came slower and eyes blinked more than usual. Boone didn't speak. He didn't gesture. He just stood still, hands by his sides, letting the moment happen around him. Because that's what men like him do. They don't take the spotlight. They become the reason others shine. And on that sacred patch of earth, amid polished shoes and folded flags, America saw itself not in a headline, not in a headline-grabbing act of heroism, but in the quiet dignity of a man who had stayed behind while everyone else left. After the service ended and the last verse of taps echoed into the sky, Boone remained by the casket. He wasn't waiting for fanfare. He was waiting for peace, for silence to say what words never could. That's when General Wallace approached, carrying something small, something folded, something aged. "This was found in Thompson's personal effects," he said quietly. "It was meant for you, only if you ever made it here." Boone took the envelope with hands that had once held rifles, lives, and now only held time. The paper was yellowed, soft at the edges, and sealed with wax like something sacred. He opened it slowly. Inside was a letter, short but heavy, written in Thompson's distinct, deliberate hand. Boone, you saved me from dying in the mud. You gave me the years to become something more than a scared kid in uniform. Every decision I made, every soldier I trained, every battle I led, it all traces back to one moment. When you turned and came back for me, I never forgot. I never stopped searching. But if you're reading this, it means you finally let yourself be seen. I hope when they say my name, they remember yours too. You're the reason I had a life to live. Your friend, Irwin. Boone folded the letter slowly, slid it into the inside pocket of his coat, and tapped it gently twice, like sealing a promise. He didn't cry. He didn't smile. He just looked up at the sky, the same sky he'd stared at 54 years earlier in the jungles of Vietnam, and whispered, "You're home now, brother." That was all. It was a month later when the idea first took root, not from Boone himself, but from the younger veterans who'd watched him lead that final walk. They wrote letters, made calls. They said they needed a place, not just a clinic, not just a hospital, but a home for the ones who carried things in silence. And they wanted it named after the man who'd never asked for anything. It didn't take long. The Thompson Foundation put up the seed money. General Wallace cleared the red tape. And when the news broke about the Boone Legacy Center, a facility for PTSD recovery, memory therapy, and veteran healing, Boone refused to attend the ribbon cutting. He said, "It's not about me," but he showed up anyway. Stood off to the side in a plain jacket, hat low over his brow. He watched young veterans walk through the doors, some still limping, others just staring like they didn't know if they were welcome. But they were, because now, finally, there was a place built not in honor of rank, but in memory of the unnamed. A place where silence wasn't sentence. It was understood. Boone didn't give a speech. He didn't even step inside. He just watched with that old steady gaze, and when someone finally asked if he was proud, he answered, "Not proud. Just glad they came home." Inside the Boone Center, next to the reception desk, sits the original wooden box Boone carried to Arlington. It's displayed behind glass, not polished, not restored, just preserved exactly as it was. Next to it is a photo of 3 young men in the mud, smiling through smoke. Underneath, the plaque doesn't list medals. It reads, some carried rifles, some carried radios. He carried the weight of memory, so others didn't have to. Veterans from all generations stop and stare at that box. Some run their fingers over the glass. Others just nod and walk on. But every single one of them understands what it means. It's not a relic. It's a reminder that not all heroes get funerals with generals. Not all scars show up on skin. And sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do is carry something quietly, so others can live loudly. Boone never asks for recognition. He doesn't sit on panels, doesn't pose for photos, but he visits the center once a week, just walks the halls, sits in the memorial garden out back, watches the wind rustle flags. When asked what he's thinking, he always replies, "Just remembering." And somehow, that's more than enough. Years passed. The country changed. Wars came and went. But on one spring morning, a familiar figure in a worn coat stood on a small hill overlooking Arlington. His hair had gone white, his shoulders narrower, but his posture was still that of a soldier who once stood when others fell. In one hand, he carried a white lily, slightly bruised from a wind. In the other, a folded letter. Not from Thompson this time. From a young Marine who had walked into the Boone Center 6 months earlier ready to give up, but left with a reason to try again. Boone walked to Thompson's grave, knelt with care, and placed a flower at the base. "You still hate flowers," he said, grinning faintly. Then he added, "But they keep bringing them anyway." He stayed there for a long time, long enough for the wind to shift, the sun to move, the world to forget time for a little while. And when he stood, someone was waiting, a young soldier in full uniform, standing just behind him with wide eyes and trembling lips. "Sir, are you the man from the story?" Boone tilted his head. "Which one?" The kid smiled. "The one who didn't leave." Boone didn't answer, just nodded, patted him on the shoulder, and said, "Make sure you don't either." Then he turned and walked away, one slow step at a time, fading into the rows of stone, into the sunlight, into the very soil he protected with silence. He didn't need a statue. He didn't need his name etched in history books. Because some men live forever, not in glory, but in the quiet echoes of the lives they helped save. And in that silence, America remembered not just a man, but what he stood for.